Bruce Bartlett. Welcome to the Bill Cunningham Show.
Happy to be here.
Bruce Bartlett, one of the best things I've read is the book Wrong on Race. Can you set forth your premise that the Democrat Party must bury its past in order to have African Americans vote for Democratic candidates by like 90%?
Well, as you know, that is the case and has been the case ever since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Lyndon Johnson supported. But for 150 years before that, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, it was the party of racism, it was the party of segregation, it was the party of Jim Crow. Every Democrat before the Civil War was a slave owner and defended slavery. Every Democrat after the Civil War opposed Reconstruction and aid to the former slaves. And for 100 years after that, every Democrat in the South was for white supremacy and segregation.
You know, Bruce, one thing to update it, in 1857, a Supreme Court with the complete support of the Democrat Party declared that African Americans were 3/5 a human being. And several days ago, the DNC meets and finds out that if you're a black man voting in the city of Detroit in the Democrat primary, you're worth about 50% of a white man voting in Georgia.
Well, actually, what you're talking about, the Dred Scott decision, was even worse than that. What they said, what the court said, and almost all of the appointees were Democrats, was that a slave was not even a person at all. He was simply a piece of property, and that's it. Just no different than your car or your truck or anything else.
And what was the political party in America that organized around the idea that slavery needed to be eliminated?
Well, of course, it was the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded in 1857 for the sole purpose of ending slavery. And they ran their first presidential candidate in 1856. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. And he found out that that slavery was so entrenched that we needed a really, really nasty, bloody war to end it.
And I've seen, Bruce Bartlett, old-time photographs of members of the Ku Klux Klan in their regalia, in their white sheets, marching around the U.S. Capitol. And all those members of the Ku Klux Klan were Democrats opposed by Republicans, correct? Well, what year were those great marches in Washington about?
Well, that was mostly in the 1920s, but the Klan, of course, was founded after the Civil War, and it was essentially the militant arm of the Democratic Party in the South. Its main purpose was to prevent blacks from voting, not so much because they were black, but because they were Republicans. See, the Ku Klux Klan would often hang and lynch and do various things to white Republicans in the South as well as to blacks. And I think this is a very misunderstood point. The Klan was essentially an arm of the Democratic Party, and it was essentially anti-Republican, not just anti-black.
And when the 14th Amendment was passed in the 1870s, the Democrats opposed it, the Republicans proposed it and passed it, correct?
That's exactly correct. And it's also worth remembering that in 1875, the Republican Congress and a Republican president passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is essentially identical to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The problem was that the Supreme Court ruled the 1875 law unconstitutional. And so the Republicans didn't get credit for doing what Johnson later did get credit for.
Well, let's jump ahead to the 20th century before we get to the 21st. Of course, those Democrats and African Americans now listening to our dulcet tones would say, well, that was history. It isn't happening recently. Let's begin with Woodrow Wilson, who was perceived as being and was the first Democratic president of the 20th century, elected in 1912 because of the split of the Bull Moose Party and the Republican Party. Talk about the racial history of President Woodrow Wilson.
I think it's very interesting that one of the very first things that Wilson did when he became president in 1913 was to institute comprehensive racial segregation throughout the entire federal civil service, where blacks had to be moved into separate offices and separate buildings. And where that wasn't possible, they actually put in room dividers to keep the whites and the blacks separated. And Wilson was also a great friend of Thomas Dixon, the author of the book The Klansman, which was a pro-Klan book, and upon which the famous movie The Birth of a Nation, a very racist movie, was based. And when the NAACP tried to boycott that movie, Wilson responded by showing it at the White House, which had the effect of completely destroying the NAACP's efforts.
And that was the first great Democratic president of the 20th century. Of course, the next great...
Well, he's the first Democratic president, not just the...
Yeah, he was this, he's perceived now by many Democrats as one of their leaders. But certainly Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the next Democratic president after Wilson. How did FDR do relative to racial relations?
Well, it's worth remembering that Franklin D. Roosevelt was an assistant secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, and one of the things that he did was to sign the order that created separate washrooms for whites and blacks in the old executive office building, which is the building right next to the White House. And when he got polio and established the famous polio treatment facility at Warm Springs, Georgia, it was a segregated facility. If you were black and you had polio, forget it. You weren't allowed in. And then later, Roosevelt, of course, became president of the United States. And when he had the very first opportunity to appoint a member of the Supreme Court, his appointee was a life member of the Ku Klux Klan, Justice Hugo Black. And we know that Black was a life member of the Klan because we have stenographic records of the meeting at which he was awarded a golden passport signifying his life membership.
So the man called by many today the grandfather of the modern Democrat Party appointed Ku Klux Klan members to the U.S. Supreme Court.